Well, the new Cold War is now officially on.
Now, the United States says it's shot down 4 drones heading towards a U.S. warship in the Red Sea. They also say Houthis fired 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles into the sea in the southern part of the international shipping lane. Iran's foreign minister is rejecting U.S. accusations it helped Yemen's Houthis attack vessels on the Red Sea. Washington says Tehran is providing drones, missiles and tactical intelligence. The US is leading a naval coalition in response, and the UK says it's sending additional warships to the region as London vows to take a tougher line on Tehran.
Now, when World War II happened, nobody called it World War II on day one. It took a while to understand what actually is happening. Same thing with the Cold War. It took time for people to call it the Cold War. We're now living in Cold War 2.0. It's just going to take some time for mainstream media to understand what actually is going on. Believe me, the think tanks and the strategists in the big governments, they already understand that it's on. And the latest moves prove that this one is going to be way worse than anything we've seen before. We just heard that another so-called Israeli-connected ship got attacked, and this time it was not in the Suez Canal, not in the specific area next to Yemen. We heard that the United States is forming a coalition to keep the Suez Canal and the Red Sea safe from the Houthi rebels. We're having daily attacks on US forces from Syrian and Iraqi militia. We have daily attacks on Israel from Lebanon by Hezbollah by firing rockets. There's a war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The Houthi rebels are blockading Egypt by closing down the Suez Canal. Russia is fighting Ukraine. We just heard that Denmark is going to allow the United States to build bases in their territory for the first time ever, similarly to what happened with Sweden and Finland, who just allowed that. So we have US forces in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, which is unthinkable 5 years ago. The map is getting set for a huge regional conflict. It may not involve US tanks firing on Iranian tanks or US tanks on Russian tanks, but this is the next Cold War. The Cold War isn't fought in the US or in Iran. It's getting fought in places like Ukraine, in places like Israel, in places like Yemen, in places like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. In this Cold War, it's all about money, domination, and clout and influence. There's a battle over who gets to be the next shot caller on the global scene. It's been the United States ever since the collapse of Russia. Now there's new challengers coming up. Iran has aspiration to be the world leader as far as the Arab world. They're dominated right now by Saudi Arabia, by the Sunnis. The Iranians want the Shiite leaders, the Iranians, to dominate and decide what happens in the Arab world. And the idea here is that the Middle East is one little piece out of this huge chessboard. And there's a reason this war in the Middle East, specifically the next stage, started. In September, the United States announces officially the new economic corridor: EU, Israel, Saudi Arabia, India. That's a huge challenger for the Russian, Azerbaijan, Iran, India corridor, and that sparked a whole new play. The Russians didn't like it. The Iranians didn't like it. The Iranians pulled the trigger. They moved the pawn forward. They've created one of the biggest terror attacks we've seen in history on Israel, killing thousands of civilians, causing a chain reaction that was supposed to prevent the Israelis from being able to serve as a functioning member in the new coalition. That coalition of this new corridor should have started with the Abraham Accords, with the normalization of the relationship between the Saudis and the Israelis. Now, they've already normalized relations with the UAE and a bunch of other countries, but the Saudis were the key piece. Once Israel got involved in the Gaza war, the idea was that it was supposed to taint Israel from being able to participate in any sort of arrangements and coalitions with Saudi Arabia. On top of it, there's huge pressure from the Iranians and the Russians to push the United States out of the Middle East, to allow the Iranians to dominate this region. It's happening with the Houthi rebels, and it's happening with Hezbollah, and it's happening with the militias in Syria and Iraq. The United States have made their own move. They formed a coalition, and they're sending actual naval forces to protect the shipping lanes that are being hijacked right now by the Houthi rebels. Now, this is the key part right now, what I'm about to tell you. Where this war is headed depends on the decision-making from the US side. It has nothing to do with the Israelis, nor the Egyptians, who are, by the way, not even participating in this coalition. It has everything to do with what move the United States makes next. And now you're going to see the chess game in its entirety. In September 2023, the United States make their first move. They announce the economic corridor. Iranians reply by moving a pawn and sacrificing the pawn, attacking Israel with Hamas, knowing full well Hamas will get demolished by the Israelis, but it might delegitimize Israel and taint Israel and will allow it to participate in the Abraham Accords, which will endanger the entire economic corridor that's being planned by the US. The US moved their piece and they put 1/5 of their naval force off the coast of Israel to basically say, hey, we're here. We're not going anywhere. It's not about Israel. It's not about Hamas. Forget about this nonsense. It's US, Iran, and Russia, right? So the US put massive naval forces off the coast of Israel to say, we're here and we're going to call the shots. We're going to show force. So the Iranians make their move. They come from the other side. So while the 1/5 of the US force is in the Mediterranean, they move from the Red Sea and they move another pawn, the Houthi rebels, and they close off the Suez Canal, suffocating one of the allies of the United States, which is Egypt. So now the US has to make their move. They have to put naval forces in the region to counter that. Now here is the kicker. This move will decide the rest of the war. This is a critical juncture. So the United States announced they're forming a naval coalition. But that announcement in itself, and even the presence of naval forces in the region, will not solve the problem. You still have to counter the Houthi rebels, who are firing ballistic missiles, drones, and actually attacking boarding ships through helicopters, taking over ships. So there's a lot of threats that have to be solved. Now, the fact is that Egypt stayed out of this, the Israelis stayed out of it, because this is a US matter. It has nothing to do with Egypt or Israel. They're just pieces in this game. So now the question is, how will the United States utilize this coalition? The Iranians are saying, look, we know you're not going to cross the line because you, the United States, are going into an election year. And you don't want a war in an election year when you already have one in Ukraine and you already have one in Israel. You don't want a third war in Yemen. It's not going to bode well for you in an election year. So you guys are going to be very, very gentle. You're going to capture some Yemenis terrorists, some Houthi terrorists, and you're going to release them back, and we're going to play this game pretending like we're doing something. But most of shipping companies will stay the fuck away from the Suez Canal because it's not going to be effective. But if the United States says, you know what, this is a national security US interest, much like the Abraham Accords, which was the Trump thing that got adopted by Biden, this is bigger than the elections. This is our national security. We're going to go full on against the Houthi rebels. We're going to go all in. We're going to destroy launch sites in Yemen from the ballistic missiles. We're going to attack specific points to prevent you guys from doing whatever it is you're doing. And we're going to go hardcore and lift the siege in a way that the entire shipping community says, no, Suez Canal is fine. The US has us covered. This is a show of force. This is going to be a huge show of force. Who wins the battle over the Suez Canal? Because if the Iranians manage to keep the Suez Canal closed effectively, this means that the Egyptians will have to gravitate towards Iran, make a deal to open up the canal. And that will take a huge ally away from the United States and get it closer to Iran, much like they've tried with Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels. When the Houthi rebels were bombing Aramco, the idea was, let's get them to talk with us. And the Saudis started to make peaceful discussions with the Iranians to get the Houthi rebels to stop bombing their shit. And that's where the United States came in with this new stuff, because they saw they're about to lose Saudi Arabia. If the United States don't open up the Suez Canal and they don't go full force, they lose the Egyptians, because the Egyptians will make a deal with Iran to make it stop, because they live off that canal. And the rest of the Arab world is watching. And if they see that the US does not project strength in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, the war is going to go a lot harder for the US. So the question is, what will the United States choose to do here? Go for political considerations and keep things quiet, or kill this threat while it's small and project force in the Middle East? That will determine everything. Now, as always, thank you so much for staying with me. And as you know, these videos are not fully monetized. based on the nature of things we discuss here. I did start a new Patreon where I post articles and videos where they have one interesting article and one video which we posted on Patreon. Check it out. If you would like to support what we do here, check out the Patreon. Otherwise, keep watching the video. Share it with people who are interested in this topic. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.